on them. But in the more populous countries, the quality of life for ordinary people has declined, and government has been seen as inefficient and corrupt. Lacking traditions of rule of law, most countries in the region have not yet been able to establish stable democratic procedures. The results so far, therefore, have been quite negative. Overthrow of a democratically elected government in Egypt, an uneasy struggle for more pluralistic politics in Tunisia and Yemen, political fragmentation and chaos in Libya, ongoing low-level protest in Bahrain, and of course, as so many of you here know, a bloody civil war in Syria. And complicating matters further is the regional rivalry between Iran and its allies on the one hand, and Saudi Arabia and its allies on the other. And the outside big powers, especially the United States, seem more confused than competent to affect the regional impasse, the regional malaise. And so I'm afraid that so far the somewhat pessimistic conclusions I came to in the book that I wrote in 1977 still hold true. Having said that, though, there's a dramatic new factor in the situation. And as the uprisings broke out in 2011, I began to think that it's time to revisit the whole question of legitimacy in the Arab world, whether there are possibilities for transitions to democracy or something else, and whether the bankrupt legitimacy formulas that were in place back in the 1960s and 70s might be giving way to something new and better. Well, that may in fact be the case, but the something new and better hasn't really materialized, although I do have some ideas and suggestions as to what it should look like. So that's the overview. Now, I'm just back from Beirut. I came almost directly here from Beirut 2 days ago, and I mention that because it's a place I'm very well familiar with, and it's also a place that has been very much affected by the Arab uprisings, especially the one in Syria. And I have to tell you that there is a great deal of nervousness in Lebanon because they feel daily, sometimes in the most violent ways, the aftershocks and the impact of the huge war and humanitarian crisis that has been unfolding next door in Syria. It is a good reminder that the transition from authoritarian rule in the Arab world is not an easy one. Now, forgive me for a moment, because I would like to start with a couple of theoretical points to give us a kind of a handle on how to study legitimacy. And I want to refer very briefly to the categories of legitimation that the famous sociologist Max Weber spelled out for us many years ago. He talked about three basic forms of legitimate rule, legitimate domination. If you're asking the question, if you're an ordinary person, why should I obey? Here were some of the answers. One was traditional legitimacy, in which he suggested that the authority of the, quote, eternal yesterday, exercised by the patriarch and the patrimonial prince of yore, prevails. And this surely is the kind of legitimacy that to some extent, although I think maybe to a declining extent, has underpinned the stability of the monarchies of the Arab world. Those being, starting from west to east today, Morocco, Jordan, and then the six patrimonial monarchical states of the Arab Gulf, of which, of course, the biggest is Saudi Arabia, and then there are a number, of course, of smaller ones. Another form, according to Weber, was charismatic legitimation. And this was the kind of political order in which accepted domination, legitimate domination, was ensured by a charismatic leader. That is to say, somebody whom the people regarded as possessing magical powers, special religious authority, somebody whose persona radiated a kind of transcendent, what would you say, sort of a transcendent magnetism. Now, there haven't been too many of those in the world or in the Middle East, but certainly at one point early on in the modern history of the Middle East, one might have said that the famous leader of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, was the kind of leader that inspired worship. Others have tried. I can't think of very many others. Possibly at one point in Turkey, a non-Arab Middle Eastern country, Kemal Ataturk, the founder of the Republic, might have exercised that kind of charismatic authority. And it's even conceivable that early in the modern history of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the sort of founder king of the modern state of Saudi Arabia at the beginning of the 20th century, was a man who inspired that kind of worship. And then the third kind was what Weber called legal legitimacy or rational legitimacy, in which he said, as you can see, by virtue of the belief in the validity of legal statute and functional competence based on rationally created rules exercised by the modern servant of the state. And this is the kind of legitimacy that we like to think broadly has taken root in Western Europe and in North America, where constitutions, rules, rule of law, and so forth are deeply enshrined and actually shape and constrain the behavior of leaders and politicians. Well, okay, so that gives us a kind of a basic way of looking at this. Now, let me make a slight amendment following another more recent political scientist named David Easton of the Weberian categories. And Easton talked about, they parallel those three categories closely, but not exactly. Easton talked about personal legitimacy. The leader is able to rule by virtue of his personality. He talked about ideological legitimacy. Oh, I'm sorry, I seem to have, very good. He talked about ideological legitimacy, how leaders and ruling elites could propagate ideological programs and symbols that would inspire great confidence. And then he talked about institutional legitimacy, in which people obeyed the bureaucracies, the structures of government, out of perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of fear. So, as we look at the Middle East now, the old legitimacy formulas, which were kind of a mixture of these three categories back in the 1960s and 70s and 80s and 90s, have been severely challenged. Back in the old days, you could say, well, Nasser ruled through personal legitimacy. He also projected an ideological program that elicited favorable response from most of the people. This was the ideology, really, of Arab nationalism, Arab unity, and so forth, socialism, national development, dignity, and certainly anti-imperialism. These were powerful, powerful symbols. I would call them legitimacy resources that Nasser was particularly well able to use. and many of the people, the lesser people that didn't have Nasser's personal legitimacy, were still able to kind of ride on this ideological legitimacy formula. That kind of underpinned the new republics that had risen up against colonial and Western imperial domination in places like Algeria, Libya, Egypt, of course, South Yemen and North Yemen, because there were two Yemens at those times, and also certainly in Syria and Iraq, where the Ba'ath Party constructed and propagated quite successfully this ideological legitimacy formula. They were less successful in developing what Weber called legal or rational legal institutions which would be respected. There wasn't really a kind of independent judiciary. There were not constitutions that really meant things. The institutions of elections and so forth were transparent and hollow and highly manipulated, and so they didn't really work very well. The only aspect of institutional legitimacy in the old Arab world that seemed to have some purchase were the institutions of the security organizations. We came to talk in political science, as we were studying the Arab world in those years, of what we called the Mukhabarat state. Mukhabarat is the Arabic term for the national security state, the state that is dominated by the intelligence services, by the secret services, by the people that would knock on your door at night and take you away, and you might never be seen again. And the Mukhabarat found not only in the revolutionary republics, but also indeed in the monarchies, provided a kind of institutional legitimacy, but not the kind that we like to think of when we think of rule of law, democracy, Bill of Rights, so on and so on. So it was a flawed formula, and I think when suddenly the roof caved in most of the Arab world at the end of 2010 and the beginning of 2011, people said, well, that's, that old formula, those formulas are just dead. They're just not going anywhere, and something new is going to happen, and maybe, we hope, something better will happen. Well, certainly something has happened, and we've seen an historic upheaval, the beginning of a process of change, that has yet to be fully realized. Let me turn quickly to a snapshot of the uprisings. I think you're all familiar with this. I don't need to dwell on them at length, but just to remind, we begin chronologically with the Tunisian so-called Jasmine Revolution, beginning at the end of 2010, with the overthrow of the Tunisian dictator Zainuddin Ben Ali. It was followed immediately by the Egyptian January 25th revolution. Mubarak was overthrown. Down at the end of this tip of the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, there was an uprising that also began about that time, and it continued for a long time. It was quite bloody. There was lots of killing, trying to overthrow Ali Saleh, the longtime president who had been a military man in Yemen, and who was clearly not corresponding to the demands of the people. Ashab yurid Scott Nidam. This was the slogan from North Africa all the way across through the Arabian Peninsula. The people demand the fall of the regime. And it was heard in Yemen, and finally, after a long period of struggle and then negotiation, Ali Saleh was peacefully sent home, and he's still there. The Yemeni case, actually, I think, is the only uprising case where the ruler who was forced out of office actually remains in the country and ready to fight another day. It wasn't long before the uprisings spread to a place that nobody thought they would spread to, which was the very rich oil exporting countries of the Gulf. And little Bahrain, which was the least oil rich of those 6 Gulf Cooperation country states, came under a severe protest from its people. And it's interesting that in Bahrain, the clear majority of the people are Shiites, while the ruling family, which is closely related to and supported by Saudi Arabia, is Sunni Muslim. And so that uprising immediately began to take on a sectarian character, and the sectarianism of Sunni Shia hostility, of course, now has spread to many other places, of course, including Syria. In the meantime, Libya was under, the Libyan regime of Muammar al-Gaddafi was under attack by elements in society, tribal elements and other elements that were tired of his quixotic but often very brutal rule. And he ruled for a very long time. So something clearly was happening. And then, of course, in the Syrian case, what began as a popular protest against authoritarian brutality soon morphed into something much more problematical, and finally a civil war, which, as we all know, goes on today. And the Syrian crisis in humanitarian terms is by all odds the most serious crisis of its kind so far in the 21st century, and really dwarfs all of the bloodshed and instability that we've seen in the other places. So those are the places where uprisings have happened. Dictators have been overthrown by one means or another. But there are also reverberations in neighboring states. In Jordan, in Oman, in Algeria, even in Saudi Arabia, in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, where the population there is largely Shiite, which is also, incidentally, the place where most of the Saudi oil is to be found. There have been protests which actually continue. And although the King of Morocco was quite agile in trying to preempt the demands of the people there were still protesters, but the king seems so far to have kept